Today we begin our study on the book of Enoch. And the first thing we need to understand on the book of Enoch and its importance is who Enoch was when he lived. It's so important. Enoch came 7 generations from God. He was the great-grandfather of Noah. And when Enoch was alive, the world was completely different than what we see now, what we know now. Everything was different. And when I say everything, I do mean everything. Human beings were living around 1,000 years, for one tiny example. And as you'll see, we're much, much larger. And so Enoch was connected to God, to the spiritual realm, in a way in our age, through the millennia and millennia that we've lived through, in being run by the beast system through all of human history, by Lucifer himself, as the God of this earth, as I've taught all on this channel over and over and over again. And I hope as a listener of mine, you understand that. Humanity has been so completely degraded that we're now to the point, physically and spiritually, where we're like chimps. We're like chimps compared to creation, compared to what God made in Adam, right? A man to live for eternity, who then sinned, whose then life was cut down to less than 1,000 years. And that's how history's been ever since sin came into the world. And the free will that we were given by our Creator was exercised by us for evil. But when Enoch was alive, people weren't living 70 or 80 years. They were living centuries. And Enoch was sent at a time by God where God already knew, because of the evils that now existed in the world in Enoch's time, as we'll get into all of it in the book. Man, there's so much to get into. And I don't want to throw out too many spoilers up front in doing that, because I want you to see it with your own eyes or with your own ears as I read it. That the perspective of Enoch and the things he was seeing were not metaphorical. We're not metaphorical. And we always make that mistake when we read prophetic writings, because there is symbolism involved. There's a lot of symbolism, but the symbolism is not complicated when you understand that they are also being literal. They're also being literal within the symbolism, and you'll see how I mean that as we dive deeper into Enoch. It's the same as the way Revelation is written. And Enoch is such a hugely important character in the history of the world. I made a video recently called The Return of Elijah, The Remnant Awaits. And I explain in there how the return of Christ, according to Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, that the return of Christ for final judgment, the great and dreadful day of the Lord, cannot happen until God sends Elijah back to set the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, to return the purity of the faith at the very end of the age before ultimate judgment, to pluck out his very, very elect that are on earth right now, to pluck us out from the beast system. And that Elijah would arise and bring back the purity of the truth of who God is and what God created, and the history of earth. and show people again, this is our Creator. This is Yahweh. This is really what we're battling for. And this is why we have to sacrifice everything in us to serve Him at the end of the age, to defeat the beast system. And so Jesus himself said that Elijah would return. The Father said in Malachi, to conclude the Old Testament, Elijah would return. And Jesus confirmed that in Matthew 11, where he told everybody that was listening, when John was in jail, he said, guess what? I have a secret. John the Baptist is Elijah. He's Elijah come back to usher me in, as he did the first time. But then he said, he is Elijah who is to come. So there'll be another coming of Elijah right before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Elijah is simply one of the 2 olive trees that are in the throne room of God that are mentioned in Zechariah chapter 4 and Revelation chapter 11. The 2 olive trees, right? And what the 2 olive trees do, and they will be the 2 witnesses on earth during the beast's reign, during those 42 months that we haven't reached yet. But they will be the 2 witnesses on earth along with 144,000. And what those 2 olive trees do in the throne room is so hugely important. Matthew chapter 17, the Transfiguration chapter, tells us exactly who those 2 olive trees are. It's Elijah and Moses. And there's a greater tree and there's a lesser tree. And Elijah's the greater tree and Moses is the lesser tree. And this is all explained in Zechariah 4. And what the trees do, these olive trees, which are trees like pine trees that are all around here, which have leaves, that they always have leaves all year round here in Wisconsin. They drop them, but they cycle like every 3 years, but you'll never see them without leaves. And so an olive tree produces oil from the olives it produces, which are its fruits, right? And so what happens in the throne room of God, and it's happened this way since before creation, since before he created the heavens and the earth, in his throne room, the high priest of all things, Yahweh, in his throne room stands 2 olive trees and a lampstand with 7 flames. And Zechariah 4 tells us that those 7 flames are the Spirit of the living God on all continents of the earth. And so what the olive trees do, and then there's a golden bowl on the top that collect the golden oil that drips out of the olive trees. The oil drips into the lampstand in the throne room of God, and then lights the fire to light the throne room, which is lighting the Holy Spirit in his eyes on the earth all at the same time. So without the olive trees dripping the oil into the golden bowl, into the base of the lampstand, the root of the lampstand, you have no fire in the throne room. And those who are the 2 olive trees, Elijah and Moses. And that's why we know reincarnation Jesus spoke of, because he said that olive tree, the olive tree that would later be mentioned in Revelation 11, is Elijah. And then, as I said, Matthew 17 shows us that the other is Moses. So Elijah is so important in history. Well, now we know there's Elijah who is to come, right? In this age. Well, guess what? The Spirit revealed to me. Enoch, as he was called in Hebrew, was also the olive tree. He was the first sending of the olive tree, the 7th generation. He was Elijah before Elijah. And that's why people in his age thought he was a madman. They thought he was an absolute religious fanatic, as we'll read in the introduction to the book of Elijah, or to the book of Enoch here. He was a religious madman. He was like living in all this evil, demons everywhere, you know, in the form of Nephilim, still physically 2 miles tall. We'll learn this. Like, he was living in a time where the fallen angels, the watchers, were mating with humans, creating these giants that were 2.12 miles tall. How 2.12 miles? Do the math on that. And how tall that is. And it's not an exaggeration. And it's not that he was that small. And that's one of the things we need to understand, is that when human beings were living like 1,000 years, they were much, much larger. And all of God's creation is much, much larger than we actually think it is. And I'm not saying the firmament we live under, but all of what was created under the firmament, all of it is much larger than we thought it was. The people, the angels, the trees reach to the firmament, which is said to be about 220 miles high. So these 2.12 mile tall giants, the Nephilim, who were the offspring of the fallen watchers, the fallen angels, and human beings, I gotta think, well, if you end up with an offspring that's 2.12 miles tall, I gotta imagine these fallen angels are at least 3 miles tall, and human beings then probably had to be at least about 1 mile tall for them to even be able to procreate physically, which they did, which took over the entire earth with these monsters, these human angel, fallen angel hybrids that to this day are still here. Believe it or not, their remains are here for sure. But what Enoch taught us is that the demons that will haunt us all the way to this day, the actual demons, are the disembodied spirits of those Nephilim, of the angelic and human hybrid that were 2.12 miles tall, 3,000 ells, he said. So that's the kind of world Enoch was living in. And the lampstand from the throne room of God got sent the first time right before, a couple of generations before, because Noah was born when Enoch was alive, but it was his great-grandson. Again, they were living so long. Enoch died only 57 years after Adam, or Enoch was born only 57 years after Adam died, although he was the 7th generation. So Noah was on the earth when Enoch was on the earth, but Enoch knew that the flood was coming, that everything was going to be wiped out, like a huge judgment of God was coming. He knew that. And he knew it was coming through his great-grandson. And Noah, as it describes Noah in the book of Enoch, your mind is going to be blown at what Noah actually looked like. My goodness. He was like a god born into the world, and nobody knew what to do with him. He came out of the womb praising God even. his hair white like wool, came out of the womb. And Methuselah and Lamech are like, father and grandfather are like, what is this? This isn't human, That was Noah, the only righteous left. But Enoch was sent just as the lampstand always is, right? Enoch was sent right before that flood to write this book, because the flood was going to wipe out everything, So Enoch knew that when he wrote this book, that his lineage would continue through Noah, right? And that eventually, at the very end of it all, he wrote this book for the very end of it all, for the very, very final judgment. For today, the lampstand wrote it to let us know now what is to come and what the world used to be like before all of this, so we can see God, just like Elijah, who returns now, will be doing. And the book disappeared because the floods came. And it disappeared for 2,000 years. And lo and behold, it starts to reappear right now, right in the last 100, 200, 300 years, when we need it. It's back. And Enoch knew that would happen. Enoch knew that would happen. And Enoch knew that in the Holy Spirit, in this age, we'd be able to understand what he was talking about fully, and that we needed to understand what he was talking about fully. We needed to understand who the enemy really is fully. So he explains things in such simplistic terms because he had to let us now, the degraded version of humanity, the chimps that Lucifer has degraded us down into, the opposite of evolution, because we live in a world where everything is upside down. He knew our human understanding in this age, in the age that's far to come, as he says over and over again, he knew our understanding would be so limited, and so he wrote it as simplistically as possible. But even in his day, he was looked at as a religious freak. And he spent most of his time in solitude with the Watchers. He even interceded to God for the fallen Watchers. They wrote all their petitions, all of the Watchers. They wrote all their petitions. We don't want to be judged for mating with human women. And Enoch took their petitions to the Father, That's how close to God he was, the lampstand, hearing directly from the Father. And so then he was sent back as Elijah when there were no prophets left in Israel. And he was sent back to usher in the return of Christ. Sent back to usher in the first coming of Christ 2,000 years ago. And now Elijah, who is to come, is here to teach us somewhere what this is all about. But I'm going to do my best in the Spirit, and I would not approach this series if I was not doing it in the Spirit. In my knowledge, I downloaded the book of Enoch, the version we're going to cover, the best version in my opinion, I downloaded it almost exactly 2 years ago. When I started reading it, I read the introduction and a few things, and I kind of dabbled around and looked here and there, and it didn't really draw me in. It didn't really, only because I wasn't understanding who Enoch really was, that he's one of the lampstands, and that he got this book somehow, some way, through the Spirit of God. Somehow God directed it through all of these millennia to get us here, to get it to us. And I'm like, well, we must need to know it. We must need to know it then, if it survived all that. And so then now, with all of the understanding that the Spirit has given me in the last 2 years since I downloaded this, when I now review it and went back to it, I was on fire. I'm like, this is unbelievable. Thank you, Enoch. Thank you, Enoch, for being a crazy man in your time, just like Elijah was, just like John the Baptist was. Thank you for being a crazy religious freak and just listening to the Father, so we know what to do now. And so I'm going to read to you the introduction of this today, and then we'll start with the first chapter tomorrow. So the version we're going to use, it's a modern English translation of the Ethiopian book of Enoch, and it's written by a guy named Andy McCracken, and it's from 2002. And it was translated, it says here, it says, special thanks to Brendan Jason Naftali, who found this translation of the Ethiopian text in the SOAS library at the University of London. Okay, so then, and Andy McCracken then took it and then translated it the best he could, trying to keep it as pure as he could. And you'll see in his introduction, he knows how important this is. And I think this reads extremely well and is easy to understand. And so his introduction, he says, I have based this book on Michael A. Nibb's scholarly translation of the Ethiopian manuscripts, which I believe to be the best translation currently available. I first heard about the book of Enoch a few years ago while I was researching into end of days prophecies. Here we are, right? When I finally managed to get hold of a copy, I discovered that it was a very strange and unusual book. The first time I read it, I was skeptical and somewhat puzzled. I wondered who would have written an odd book like this. And most people feel that way when they hear the book of Enoch. Well, that's because Lucifer has to confuse us with it. Just like with Revelation, it gets too confusing to understand. And then the Spirit unlocks it and it's like, wow, no wonder this has been hidden for all of history. No wonder it's so easy to lie to us about the history of the world when you don't give us the history of the world, right? Man, it's crazy. I knew that Enoch, or Hanok in Hebrew, was very favorably mentioned in Genesis. He again, like Elijah, he was one of two people in history that were taken up. Enoch was taken up at 365 years old. Elijah was taken up, and then John the Baptist came in, but he was beheaded. He was beheaded in jail. He wasn't taken up. But then when Elijah, who is to come, one of the two witnesses is here witnessing, and at the end of his witness, he also was taken up with Moses at the very end. After being killed and laying his dead for 3.5 days, he's taken up for the last time. Taken up for the last time. Up and down he goes, the lampstand, because the lampstand needs to bring the golden oil to earth once in a while. That's the keyest times in human history, the most key times. He needs to bring that golden oil that's lighting the throne room of God and lighting the seven flames, lighting the seven flames on the lampstand. He needs to bring that oil to earth once in a while in God's wisdom. And I discovered that Enoch's book describes the Exodus and Moses very favorably, although not by name. So again, he would have been prophesying about Moses. So my theory was that it might have been written around the same time as the Torah, perhaps around 1400 BC. It was his theory. However, after several readings, I could find no plausible theories. The prophecy of the animals is extremely precisely written and obviously refers to events well after Moses. See my notes in that chapter, he says. Additionally, who would have dared to produce a book with people such as Moses described in terms of farm animals, he says. Michael Nibb, whose translation I have used to produce this book, studied all available manuscripts and sources, and it's clear that this book was well known and studied in many countries well before the time of Jesus, right? The earliest known surviving fragments and quotations in various languages show that this is the same book and that the Ethiopians have preserved it well. In the end, I was convinced that the book is really Enoch's true account of otherwise forgotten events that occurred in early times, events that we may have no other surviving records of. This stuff is fact, man. It's fact, Jack. There's no doubt in my mind. It's why you would never be exposed to this in history class, because they're lying to you about the globe to begin with. That's the first thing they show you in preschool, the big globe. You know, I mean, they lie about everything from day one. Why would then they couldn't introduce something like this to us? Because the beast runs it all, and the beast doesn't want us to know who we are in Christ, and who we are as the creation of the Father, who we really are. Enoch left us a book that describes people of an advanced culture, blonde-haired people that Enoch's people understood to be angels of God. And it was written, okay, so that's talking about the angels he sees, the watchers. And it was written on the angels' instruction. The standard academic view seems to be that some slightly demented religious fanatic wrote the book. That's an easy way to write off anybody who's speaking truth. That's a religious fanatic. Not long before the earliest provable fragments, which were 200 or 300 BC. I think it's possible to support this view. Such an author would have to be able to write the entire book from the point of view of a person who knows nothing of countries with names or religions with names. So he has to do it fully under the understanding of God, right? Then he goes on to describe the angels as blonde men who ran away from heaven in order to be promiscuous with women. I don't believe this is the sort of worldview that could have been well received or widely accepted anywhere in 200 BC. This, plus all the too accurate prophecies, are probably the reason why it was lost by the religions that used to regard it as holy. Lost, right? I concluded that the book is probably what it appears to be: well-preserved, ancient, and genuine. Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah and father of Methuselah, who was the longest man to ever live. And his book gives a unique view of the world before the flood, with recent research suggests may have occurred as long as 17,000 BC, he says, which I don't believe dates like this in world history. I believe strongly we are on a 7,000-year timeline since creation. God does everything in sevens. You'll see it even more in the book of Enoch, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. Everything is in sevens. And so I'm 99.999% certain we are on a 7,000-year timeline, ending the 6,000th year, because the 7,000th year is the millennial reign, the 1,000 years of rest, the day of rest for the saints of this age. So the history of the book of Enoch, it says, the book was thought to have been lost for over 2,000 years, with many ancient sources referring to it and even quoting parts, but no complete copies were known. Then in 1773, James Bruce, so 1773, 3 years before Freemasonry began, May 1st, 1776, James Bruce, or the Illuminati, they say, James Bruce brought 3 copies back from Ethiopia, having spent some years exploring the country. Enoch had 2 main reasons for writing his book. Now you know the real reason. Let's see what this guy said. The reason is exactly within the context, but we know from how he starts the book, he wrote it for us right now to let us know what we need to do. The first was because the watchers instructed him to do so. The second reason was to save his family from the coming flood, right? Enoch wrote his book, and his grandson Lamech was born. But before let me read that again. Enoch wrote his book after his grandson Lamech was born, but before Noah was born. So he wrote his book before Noah was born. Noah is only named in the section that Methuselah wrote, and of course in his own section where Noah writes. So there may still have been 40 to 80 years left before the flood at the time when Enoch wrote the book. So he was seeing ungodly evil at that time, just like we are now. There was a long gap between the time of the flood and the time when Moses gave praise to Enoch in Genesis. Genesis dates from around 1400 BC. And so he's saying the flood happened around 12,000 or 17,000 BC, he said. But even so, even if the flood happened, say, around 1500 after the start of creation. So 1500 years or so, or 1200 years or so into creation. It still would have been thousands of years before Enoch was mentioned again in Genesis by Moses in 1400 BC. And forms part of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. In Genesis, there is Enoch's family as named by him in the book, and a quick recap of some of Enoch's story. It seems likely, therefore, that copies of the book of Enoch survived into Egyptian times around 3500 BC. Okay, so there's the 2,000-year gap between 3500 BC and 1400 BC, and was known to Moses around 2,000 years later. Okay, so 3500 to around 1500 BC. Moses presumably took a copy of the book with him when they all left Egypt, and he was no doubt pleased to see Enoch's prophecy fulfilled. The book probably existed mainly in Hebrew during the 1,000 years after the Exodus. No Hebrew copies exist today. This was in 2002. I don't know if that's still true. You can check. I'll check myself. But he says no Hebrew copies exist today. However, although there are some Hebrew passages quoted in some of the Aramaic fragments that survive from a few centuries BC. Okay, the appearance of the book in Ethiopia is probably due to events in Jerusalem during the reign of King Manasseh of Judah, which was 695 to 642 BC, which are documented in the Bible in 2 Chronicles 33 1 through 20 and 2 Kings 21 1 through 18. King Manasseh was not of the Jewish faith. He erected altars to Baal. And Baal has always been around. You know, that's who Elijah was battling, the god Baal in his time even. You know, Baal has always been. So King Manasseh was out of the Jewish faith. He erected altars to Baal and Asherah in Solomon's temple. In 1 Kings 21:16, it says that so much innocent blood was shed that it filled Jerusalem from end to end. At this time, the religious establishment left the country, taking the Ark of the Covenant and all the important religious texts with them. So it came out of Egypt. The probably one copy that still existed of the book of Enoch then came out of Egypt with them. See how it's just traveled through history somehow to get to us now. It's amazing that it's gotten to us now. When you think of the world Enoch was living in, and it's something he sat down and wrote then that we can read today. It's just mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Oh, man. After a number of years in Egypt, the refugees went further south near to the source of the Nile at Lake Tana in Ethiopia. The descendants of these people are the Phalashas, who even today follow the form of Judaism that has been practiced in Israel only before 620 BC. The Ethiopians translated the book of Enoch into Ge'ez and had enough respect to look after it. God put that in their hearts, I'm sure. Of course. Meanwhile, all Hebrew versions disappeared, but a substantial part of the book had survived in Greek and some in parts in Aramaic. But until Scottish traveler and Freemason James Bruce, Freemason, imagine that, because they wanted the knowledge for themselves and not to share with us. Oh, the Freemasons. James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773 with 3 manuscripts. No one in the West had ever seen the whole book. The two commonly available translations were done soon after this, and the book was received with an embarrassed silence for the most part, and not widely read, because nobody was going to understand it at that time. This book is based on a new translation published in 1978, which was produced as a result of research into a large number of the Ethiopian manuscripts and a review of all other surviving fragments. So this is trying to put it all together for us, this particular version we're going to cover. My hope is that the present edition will be the best version of Enoch's book available in English. I think this is an important book. He says, I think this is an important book, and I have done my best to present it as clearly as possible and in a way that I hope Enoch or Hanok would have approved of. I love that. I love that. Condition of the text, and he's going to talk about that, so we're going to skip that for now. But so we see how this book really has traveled through history and just made a miraculous seeming reappearance for us in the last couple hundred years. But really now with modern technologies, and the translations we can do with it, we can finally unlock all the secrets of Enoch. And that's what this series is going to do. That's exactly what this series is going to do starting tomorrow. And I'm excited to find out what it's going to unlock as we dive into it. Because I know when I did my whole Revelation series 2 years ago, man, as I was doing the series, I thought I was ready. I thought I knew, and God just took it in a path I never would have seen. And I learned so much myself through doing that series. It built my understanding. Enoch even talks about that in the book of Enoch, how when we talk through things and when we describe them and explain them to people, we ourselves learn more. And so I learned a lot more about Revelation just doing the series. And I know the same thing is going to happen for me doing this series of Enoch, which I think is going to be much, much longer than the Revelation series. But what could be more important? What could be more important than understanding the actual earth that God created fully understand it, to understand the angelic realms, to understand the realm that Yahweh himself lives in better. We can understand that better because he showed Enoch a lot of it, because Enoch's one of the lampstands. He's from that realm. He's from that realm. He's a lampstand. He was there before Adam was ever created. And so was Moses as the other lampstand. So that's why God could show Enoch directly the details that he did. And Moses being his offspring, and Moses was an absolute miracle. Moses, God had to send an angelic, God-like figure to the earth in the form of Moses in order to have one left on earth, only one left on earth at that time in all of that evil. That person had to be born worshiping God, or nobody would have been left that would have been saved, you know. And Enoch had to usher that in, both spiritually and physically, with Noah being his offspring. And so the lampstand, man, we're gonna dive deep into the importance of that, the lampstand, and the candlestick, and the stick, and the flames, and what it all really means to us in this age, and why in Zechariah 4, for example, does it say there's 2 olive trees and 1 lampstand, but then in Revelation chapter 11, there's 2 lampstands. There's 2 olive trees and 2 lampstands. Well, I know the answer to that, and I can't wait to share with you the details of it. But we got to get there first. And so starting again tomorrow, we're going to get into chapter 1. I can't wait to uncover what God has to show to us. It's everything we need to know right now. We're going to tie it all in with Revelation as we go, and tie it all in with Matthew 24, and tie it all in with Daniel as we need to, and make sure we're understanding the fullness of the prophecy that the olive tree has been passing down to us now for thousands of years.